Good morning, everyone. I'll ask you to quickly take your seats and we'll begin our sessions for the day. My name is Chris Horbaczewski. I'm the Vice President, External Relations here at the University of Victoria. And I would like to welcome you all back, those who are attending in person and of course those who are joining us virtually. Thank you very much for coming to this last day of the 2022 Victoria Forum, which is being held in person and broadcast from the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. We acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Before we begin, I would like to just go through a few housekeeping items, if you don't mind. This morning, we'll be together for 3 plenary panel discussions. If you have any questions during our plenary sessions, please raise your hand during the Q&A portion, and a volunteer will run a mic over to you. You may find it easier if you move to the end of the aisle so that the volunteer can hand you the mic. For our virtual audience, enter your question in the chat, and we will have a team member who will bring these questions to life in the room. During our lunch later today, our in-person attendees are invited to take their lunch and attend Senator Rosa Galvez's keynote presentation in the David Turpin building from 12:30 p.m. until 1:30 p.m. Following lunch, 2 blocks of roundtable sessions will be taking place in the David Strong building and the David Turpin building from 1:30 to 3 p.m. and then again from 3:30 to 5 p.m. Note that with the exception of the session titled The Promise of Democratic Innovations for Student Voice in Universities, these roundtable sessions are taking place in person only. We conclude the forum later today with our closing reception at the Mystic Market, located just outside of the main doors here of the Farquhar Auditorium. And I encourage you and invite you to join us for some light refreshment as well as some final networking opportunities. The forum shuttle for hotel guests will be returning to the host hotels, both the Fairmont Empress and the Marriott Inner Harbor, after the reception at 8:45 p.m. this evening. Before we launch into our first session, I would also once again like to thank and acknowledge our event sponsors. Without their support, an event like the Victoria Forum, of course, would not be able to take place. Van City, the Gustafson School of Business, TELUS, Power Corporation of Canada, and the Government of Canada. And now, I would like to introduce Susan Black, Chief Executive Officer of the Conference Board of Canada, to the stage. And I would also like to welcome the Right Honourable David Johnston, former Governor-General of Canada, who is joining us virtually for our first panel discussion today titled Bridging Divides and Trust, a Conversation with the Right Honourable David Johnston.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Day 3 of the 2022 Victoria Forum. I hope you've enjoyed the first couple of days and been to some great sessions. I went to a couple yesterday afternoon, and I can tell you the debate was very lively. So without further ado, let's move to this morning's plenary, which is on trust, one of the key themes of the conference. And I'm delighted to be able to speak this morning with the Right Honourable David Johnston, our Governor-General from 2010 to 2017, who's coming to us from his home in Ontario today. So good morning, Your Honour, and a warm welcome to you.
Hi, Susan. Please call me David. Great to be with you and great to be in touch with that wonderful University of Victoria.
It is, and it's a beautiful day and a beautiful campus and a great event. So this summer, David, I had the opportunity to read the book, Trust. Here we go, 20 Ways to Build a Better Country. And I have to say, it was very inspiring to read about your love of Canada and your passion for helping us build a better future. And as someone who leads an organization in this country, it really made me pause and think about the ways, as a leader, as a citizen, I could work on trust. So it's thoughtful and thought-provoking and frankly practical. So I'm hoping we can dig into that today, and perhaps the place to start is by talking about what trust actually is and why it's so important. So I'm going to share with you the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition of trust. And Merriam-Webster tells us trust is the assured reliance on the character, ability, strength, or truth of someone or something, one in which confidence is placed. Now, at the beginning of your book, you make an intriguing distinction between courage, which is often viewed as a distinguishing characteristic that precedes or makes way for other important personal characteristics, and trust. And you say, actually, trust is more important. So can you talk about what trust means to you and why it takes precedence over other characteristics?
Well, thank you, Susan. It's great to be with you to have this conversation. I would say that trust doesn't exclude other important values, and courage is certainly one of them. Empathy is another. Hope is a third. In fact, the sequel book to Trust we've written is called Empathy. That's in press now, comes out in January. And I see those 3 or 4 characteristics as pretty fundamental to who we are as people, but also what we are as a society. The Webster definition speaks to someone or something, and that's appropriate to look to for trust. But it's also important in terms of broad social relationships, and in particular, a country or a society. And in fact, what motivated us to write the book Trust was my increasing concern about receding trust in public institutions in our society. The other thing I would say about trust is it may be more all-pervasive than, say, courage or even empathy, which we think of as sort of individual characteristics, showing courage in the face of battle or making a very difficult decision. But trust is that, but it's also broader in terms of relationships within a community, within a family, within a partnership, and within a society. And so you attack it from a number of points of view. George Shultz, a man whom I admired enormously, died last year at age 99, who was Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Labor, I think, and Chief of Staff to both Republican and Democratic presidents, so served both administrations in the United States, once said, trust is the coin of the realm. When you have trust in the room, whether it be the boardroom, the training room, the operating room, the military room, things go well. And when you don't, they don't. Everything else is detail. And I think there's a lot in that trust is a foundation for so much. I describe trust as both the grease and the glue that holds society together and the grease that makes things go easier. Many of you would be familiar with the writings of Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. His son, Stephen Covey Jr., building on that 25 million copy book, The 7 Habits, wrote a book called The Speed of Trust, and here's an equation. Trust equals cost and time. When you and I have a trust relationship, we come to an agreement over a cup of coffee in a half-an-hour conversation, and we might have a letter just exchanging what we've agreed on. Very limited amount of time necessary. Cost is the cup of coffee. On the other hand, if we don't have a trustworthy relationship, we're probably negotiating for weeks. We end up with a 100-page contract, and that's filled with all sorts of exclusives and waivers and arbitration clauses and so on. So it's pretty important to society generally. And as I say, what moved us to write the book was my real concern about diminution of trust in a variety of ways, in particular our public institutions.
So let me pick up on that. We have to always consider these things within the times in which we live, and these are very turbulent times. So we've just come through, hopefully, the first global pandemic in 100 years. Inflation is at a 40-year high, the cost of living skyrocketing, the income gap is increasing. We watched Russia invade Ukraine with global consequences for all of us. In this country, there were horrific discoveries of the remains of children at residential schools and the shameful legacy of that. Are there things happening in our world right now that makes focusing on trust even more important?
Yeah, I think you've listed 3 or 4 factors that have sort of combined for a near perfect storm. And to them, I would add a couple of others. The digital revolution, I'll speak a bit more about that. Globalization with all of its benefits, but with some of its penalties. The global financial crisis of 2008, which I think shuttered our financial institutions. Profits were capitalized and losses were socialized and had reverberations right around the world. I would especially mention, though, that the diminution of the international order that traded with the United Nations and other global institutions following World War II, and helped us in terms of a more harmonious world. And that began to diminish, I think, about 10 years or so ago, and it's substantially receded, whether it's the United Nations power, the World Bank, the Bretton Woods Agreement, World Trade Organization, etc. But most of all, it's Pax Americana, which I think helped to preserve peace from 1945 on, beginning with quite a remarkable thing, the Marshall Plan, which is one of the few times in history where a conquering nation reached out and brought back to life the defeated countries to put them back on their feet. Look how Japan and Germany revived, etc. That's eroded a lot, and we've got a degree of chaos. But the most important one, I think, is the digital revolution, which is transforming our society and how we handle information, and has so many great features to it, but some not necessarily unintended consequences, but serious consequences that divide us, and fake news being one example. And bear in mind that it took 3 centuries for the printing press from the 15th century on to reach the majority of the population of Western Europe, with much struggle, beginning with the control of knowledge, the church in the 15th century, 14th century. And in that 3-century transformation, when people moved from being operating on the basis of tradition only and fixed status to become more free-thinking individuals, we saw the rise of the Industrial Revolution, the migration to cities, the beginnings of working democracies, and so on. In Western Europe, which was a backward society, Islam, India, and China surpassed all of those because that printing revolution made such a difference. Well, the internet, which essentially came into being in 1993, 1994, in about a decade and a half, reached the majority of the population of the whole world. And we have not been at the time yet to develop the rules of the road, the kind of civilized customs, the constraints on excessive with that digital revolution that we did in 300 years with the printing press. And I think that digital revolution is more prominent. And it's wonderful in the sense that I'm a teacher by trade. For the first time, we have data, information reaching every corner of the world at virtually no cost. And what a wonderful opportunity to educate the globe. On the other hand, we have some excesses and so on that present great problems for us. So those are, I think, features of this uncertainty, but it's also a time of great providence when we think of the advantages that have come from science and discovery and application. And I think that's the challenge, is how we manage our world with a different set of tools, but do so with peace and harmony, and people living not in conflict, but in sharing knowledge and helping one another. And I think trust is pretty fundamental in that respect.
So let me pick up on the digital revolution, and you're right, the explosion of information available to everybody is a defining characteristic of the world we live in now. It is troubling, though, how much people debate the truth, if you will. At the Conference Board, we often say we're living in a post-truth world. You've got a great phrase in the book or sentence where you say people who trust tailor their views to the facts, not their facts to the views. So given the explosion of information, given things like that are fostered on social media, like conspiracy theories and so on, what advice do you have for people on how to manage that information overload so that we make decisions based on facts? We may not agree on the interpretation, but that we are evidence-based.
Yeah, I think probably the answer, Susan, is as old as Aristotle. How do you develop discriminating minds? How do you separate, wheat from chaff? How do you move from data to information to knowledge to wisdom? And each of those is an important transition. One of my great friends, who's an eminent cardiologist, once said the biggest step is from knowledge to wisdom. And he said, one of my mentors said to us about making judgments in healthcare, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is knowing that you don't put a tomato in a fruit salad. And I guess that's a very important sort of discriminating remark. But I think we use the digital revolution with the fact that it spreads data, very widely. And with, I guess, the right kind of algorithms, you get to some information and some knowledge and maybe even some wisdom. But I put just great faith in our education systems. And I think Canada, this blessed country of ours, not perfect, but golly, it's pretty good on so many fronts. And in particular, an education system which I don't think has a rival in the world in terms of equality of opportunity, accessibility, a genuine determination that we will make education available to all of our citizens, to expand their talents to the very limits and beyond, and then use that knowledge base to increase the good for humankind. And how do you develop that? Well, we have 5 daughters, and I say all the important things in life I've learned from my children, and I don't say that really in jest, because I often use the lens they see the world through as sort of informing my own mind. And they began international exchanges at age 12, and it was really transforming for them. 4 things happened to them through that period of being exposed to difference. One, they became more curious, their whys, asking the question why, became more informed and more penetrating. Secondly, they became more tolerant, not just tolerant and you're different from me, that's okay, nobody gets hurt, but why are you different and what makes that difference and how does this marry with my preconceptions of things? Thirdly, their judgment became better. They're really quick to spot bigotry. They always wanted the other side of the story before they came to judgment. They were pretty good on saying empirical evidence is important, like a good surveyor that triangulates to measure distances. But most important of all, they became more empathetic, which means not sympathetic. I'm sorry for your plight, how sad it is, but I see your plight and I walk with you in your shoes to make it better. And those are the kind of qualities I think that we need in individuals, particularly with our young people as we face this world. And I'm so delighted that you've actually had student essays on these subjects as part of your conference. We learn from young people.
Well, that's very interesting. You pick up on a couple of themes in your book there. One is you coined the phrase, I think it was a knowledge diplomat. So this notion that you just mentioned of sharing, of going out into the world and sharing our knowledge, sharing it across cultures, across borders, across disciplines. How do you think Canada is doing well in terms of being a knowledge diplomat? Could we do more?
Well, I think Susan, we begin with a good base, and we can do better. And any good institution says, yes, in this respect, we're good. Now, how do we do better? And that should be Canada, not arrogant about what we have, but determined about what we can do better. It's hard to imagine a country that has as good a reputation in the world for trustworthy governance, for fair dealing, but particularly for education. And I'll just illustrate that with a couple things. When I was GG, we made state visits to other countries. We were to 56 different countries in the 7 years, and one was to Brazil. And we always went with a delegation, and this had an education theme, and Canadians had established a bilateral forum with Brazil on higher education and research, the first conference being in Calgary, and the second was in Brasilia, and we had, I think, 35 Canadian university presidents with us as part of the delegation. And we met with President Dimla, the president of Brazil, for about 2 hours at the capital. And the first 45 minutes was kind of usual exchanges of people-to-people relationships. And then we came with a mission. Her predecessor, President Lula, had established a Brazil scholarship program to send young Brazilian university students to other countries for a year or more of international education. And we had thought that we would be one of the first 5 countries to receive these students. There were 20,000 a year. And we learned to our disappointment that we were excluded from the top 5. US was the largest recipient, then the UK, France, Italy, Germany was in there. And so we took it up in a polite but firm way with President Dimla, and she was looking with great surprise. And then all of a sudden, her English is good, but she broke into Portuguese with her 4 or 5 ministers there, and the temperature got more and more heated, and the voices were rising, mainly hers, with some very apologetic looks and responses on the part of her ministers. And then she turned to me and says, "I apologize, but I was not aware of this." And I just explained to my colleagues here as to why Canada should be at the top of this list. And this is what I've told them, that 1, the quality of your education is second to none in the world. Number 2, it's affordable and accessible. Number 3, our students will be safe in your cities, in your campuses. Number 4, what you do is not simply an academic exchange, but it's a cultural exchange where our students will be in the homes of young Canadians and being beyond their classroom, integrating them. But she says, most important of all, I want young Brazilians to be exposed to young Canadians, because I find young Canadian people civil, respectful, energetic, and focused. They're just the young people that I think are good influence. And you know, that's the kind of reputation we have. I was at the Millikan conference in San Diego 4 or 5 years ago speaking, and Michael Millikan, who runs the conference on innovation each year, asked to spend 15 or 20 minutes with me, and I was delighted and sat down. He said, "I want to see you as a representative of Canada, because we just bought one of the international high school networks that comes out of Canada. I think it was the Maple Company, but I may have it wrong." And he said, "It's based in Singapore." And he said, "The reason we have done so is because the Canadian brand for education is so good, and it's known as such around the world." So with that preamble, Susan, what I would say is I really think that we should aspire, and I'm getting a little romantic here, to be the Athens to the new Rome's, and that we would see knowledge as the important measurement of sovereignty, not the size of your gross domestic product or the number of ships you can put in your Navy or your military expenditures, etc., but to see knowledge as something that you want to share as widely as you possibly can with the world, and that Canada would be the country of all where people would want to come to study and expand and develop collaborative relationships. And in the book, we use the wonderful metaphor from Thomas Jefferson, who says, "This knowledge is like the light from a candle. And when you light your unlit candle from my lit candle, my light is not diminished, it's enhanced." And that's what my ideal for Canada would be, is be candle lighters to the world and use knowledge as an act of diplomacy.
Well, I love that aspiration to be the Athens to the Rome, and I think it's wonderful for us as Canadians to have grand aspirations, particularly when we can see how we can fulfill them. So I'm sure we'll all ponder that and think about how we can bring that to life. I want to go back to something you said earlier about why you wrote this book, and you talked about the decline of trust in institutions and how trust is the glue that holds a society together. The World Economic Forum published an article, you probably saw it in December of 2020, where they also shared that sentiment and said trust is the glue. And you know, one of the themes that you talk about, trust being the bedrock of democracy, they talked about. They also said, though, that this was a pivotal moment for trust building globally. Do you agree with that? And if so, how do we rebuild trust at that level?
Well, I agree with you very much, Susan. In fact, Edelman Trust is a foundation that we actually have a partnership with, the Dorito Hall Foundation, which we set up when I was GG in 2012, to work on trust in our public institutions. And Edelman has been measuring what you've just described, trust in societies, for the past 20 years plus. And 2 years ago, that year, Canada fell into the distruster category for the first time. That is, more than 50% of our population did not trust government, NGOs, media, or business for their ideas and information. And generally speaking, preferred social media as the source of information and thought, etc. And I guess that was part of, again, the motivation of writing this book, my concern about the decline of trust in our own public institutions and then generally around the world. But as we thought about it and began writing, we said, how do you have trust in your society, in your country, in its public institutions? Well, it comes out of trust in more local situations, trust in your own family, trust in your neighborhood, trust in your community, trust in your local municipality, in your various social associations, trust in the enterprise where you work every day. Is trust there or not? And then where does that come from? Well, it comes from individuals. And so we reversed the arc of the book rather than starting with trust in public institutions to trust in oneself. And having established that consciousness of trust in oneself, how does one see it developing in trust in one's immediate associates and communities and so on? And how do you transfer that from regional opportunities and networks to national opportunities network? And as the theme we're just discussing, how do we transfer that to the world? Joe Nye is the former dean of the Kennedy School of Government, who writes about soft power, and Robert Putnam, another former dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, writes about social capital, those two together. And the soft power are the values of a country as opposed to the hard power, which is your munitions, your force, etc. And he praises Canada in one of the international surveys. Canada is #1 in the world in terms of soft power influence, the respect that the value system of Canada has helped the rest of the world. And so without being arrogant, I think we continue to work really, really hard at this blessed country of ours and its democratic institutions, and especially the equality of opportunity that comes from education, and demonstrate that equality of opportunity and excellence are not mutually contradictory values or objectives, but mutually reinforcing. And then in an appropriately humble but persistent way, say, let's share our models with the world and learn from them and help other nations rise to a higher sense of soft power.
No, very well put. And I did find it intriguing in the book that while we have these global challenges and national challenges with trust in institutions, you said it starts with individuals. You start with the individuals. And you've got a number of chapters that talk about what we as individuals can do to build trust. And one of the ones that really struck me is you said, people should show up, they shouldn't show off. Remember that? And you talked about, grandstanding is the opposite of running hard on the backstretch. So can you expand on that notion of aligning how we are at home versus our public personas? Why is it so important those things be aligned and be consistent? How is that the starting point?
Yeah, I could tell a million stories about that, Susan. I'm an ancient hockey player, and my wonderful coach I had used to say, Johnny, it's the name on the front of the sweater, it's not the name on the back of the sweater. And you know that old expression, when all is said and done, more will be said than will be done? Turn that on its head. Do more and talk less, I think, is pretty important. And part of that is just knowing who you are, and realizing that yes, you're a special individual and so on, but I think where you really gain your sense of joy is how you project beyond the I, the we, and in your associations with other people, improve their lot. And a degree of humility is important. I think chapter 1 or chapter 2 of the book, beginning with this, start with yourself in terms of trust. The question is, who am I? And we tell a story of, there was a trip to, I think where were we? Cambridge Bay. It was one of the northern communities. It was just above the Arctic Circle. It was in August, and we arrived there about 9 o'clock in the morning, going to spend part of the day there. And lo and behold, when we arrived, all the villagers were gathered around, but not to see us, my wife and myself, but because there was a Terry Fox run occurring.
Ah.
And Sharon and I and our children and now our grandchildren, I guess, had run or participated in every Terry Fox run since they first occurred. And the Terry Fox fountain sits right outside Rideau Hall, and so we would often have runs going around that fountain. And, it exemplifies so much, that remarkable story of Terry Fox and doing so much for cancer and helping one another in the world. But in any event, I was there at the starting line. We had leisure clothes, so Sharon and I got into our jogging clothes, and at the starting line, just before the race started, a little guy about 8 years old came up and tapped me on the shoulder. He says, "Who are you anyway?" I said, "I'm the Governor General of Canada." He says, "Well, what's your name anyway?" I said, "My name is David." He says, "Well, David, how old are you anyway?" I said, "I'm 71. He said, 71? I didn't think anybody could get that old. So we did the run and we came back and I found the little guy and I put my arm around his shoulder and I says, "Not dead yet anyway." And I thought, isn't that wonderful? I mean, this little guy didn't know me from Adam, and he was direct enough to say, "I don't know who you are or what you are, but you got some of these people wandering around with you as if you're important." This was the Mounties, etc. But I was just another runner, and the fact that at 71 years old I could stumble 5 kilometers was okay to him. But that puts things in perspective. That it's not about you. And I'm a great fan of David Brooks' writing. David Brooks is an editorialist for the New York Times. His latest book is called The Second Mountain, and David describes the type A personalities, like most of all of us in the room there at University of Victoria, who have achieved a measure of success climbing up that first mountain and being acknowledged by our peers as being successful people and leaders and all of that stuff. And I guess we derive a degree of satisfaction from that, even happiness. But he says if you're really lucky, as you're climbing up that first mountain, you'll look across the valley to a second mountain. And on that mountain are other toilers struggling upwards, very often with difficulty. And again, if you're lucky, you'll cross over that valley and you'll take them in hand and you'll march up that mountain together. And the so-called satisfaction or happiness that you experienced in the first mountain turns to something different. It's the experience of joy, true joy in helping other people. And I guess that's what's at the core of show up, but don't show off. Be there as a trustworthy person, and have much of your focus on that. I say to young people, if you can move from the first person singular to the first person plural, from me to we, a great weight drops off your shoulders, because all of a sudden the whole universe doesn't depend on you and how you're regarded by your peers and so on. It becomes something that you share with others and helping others. One of my many favorite people is Walton Tinchuk, who was Chief of Defense Staff when I became GG. Currently is Deputy Minister of Veterans Affairs. And we became really close pals. And when he retired, he had a party gathering at the mess hall for his classmates from RMC and so on. He was kind enough to invite me, and I was so flattered that I would be included in that group of his peer buddies. And he said to them, he says, "I've been so lucky in my career. I grew up as a Ukrainian Canadian in Winnipeg, and I was a spindly guy. They called me Pencil because I was kind of thin and so on. But he said, I joined Army Cadets and I did well in them. And then I went to RMC and I did well there. And by 35 or 36, I was Lieutenant Colonel in the Army. I never dreamed that I'd be that, running a tank platoon. And I guess I'd been lucky. I was promoted beyond my age and so on. And here I was, Walton Tinchuk from North End, Winnipeg, and I was a lieutenant colonel with 1,000 people under my command. And I was on cloud 9 for about 24 hours, and then that began to dissipate, and something changed in me. And all of a sudden, I realized that my world was now my responsibility for 1,000 people under my command. It had nothing to do with the great triumphs of Walton Tinchuk. And he said, I became a man of joy from that. And that story lives with me. Walt's an outstanding Canadian, and he's a guy who's known how to experience joy from getting satisfaction on seeing the success of other people and helping them along.
Well, there are a number of lessons in the book that speak to character like that and speak to leadership more generally. And one of the other ones that really struck me was the sentiment you said, let's focus on doing the right thing, not doing the thing right. Yeah. So, we're in a business school today, and often I think in business schools, we focus on the operational imperative. We want things to be efficient and to be effective, and we're very good at schooling people on that. But I read that chapter as a call to action to always take a moment as a leader, as a citizen, and think about the moral imperative. Can you give us some examples, some real life examples of this idea in action, where people took, paid attention to doing the right thing, not just getting done what they needed to?
Yeah, we certainly don't want to denigrate doing things right, constant improvement, efficiency, et cetera, and whatever we do, et cetera. But there are a number of illustrations I can make, Susan. Gosh, if we had 3 hours, I'd go on and on. But one is the famous medical slogan, "Operation successful, patient died." That wretched patient did the right things according to procedure, and they went and died on me. What's that all about? Another illustration was when I was at Rideau Hall in the first week. I think it was day 7 or day 8. I came into my office and the desk was that high with file folders, all of them including documents that had to be signed, the legislation, regulations, order in council, commissions, letters, etc. And each file had the document that was to be signed, but it had a cover sheet, and on the cover sheet were 6 or 7 different signatures. And I said, why are there 6 or 7 different signatures on this? And they said, well, these are the different stages that this had to go through, sir, before it comes to you for signature. I said, 6 or 7 different stages? That's a lot of stages. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of brain power. I'm not a believer in edicts, but I said, guess what? We're going to start a pilot project, and we'll call it 1 over 1 in 1. The first one is the person who drafts the letter, the order in council, whatever. The second one is me. And as I later learned, I would sign about 50,000 documents in a year. And I said at that time, I knew that there were, don't count on me to read word for word every document I sign. It's impossible. I'm depending upon that first number 1 to be sure that it is appropriate for me to sign. So that was the first one, was the drafts person, and the second one was me. Mm-hmm. The other 5 or 6 people along the way, I said, you are no longer overseers who are reviewing this document to correct its imperfections, etc. You are coaches, mentors, your helpmates of the first one who drafts the letter, who will go to you with any concern he or she has to get the answer, etc. And your job will be coach, not grade person, and putting down. And you will help this first person, the first I, to actually take full responsibility for that document. And that transformed their responsibility to their, quote, subordinates, unquote. Now, the final one in one was in 1 day, in other words, 24 hours. We will have a working principle that when a proposal comes to us to prepare and sign an order in council, that will be turned around, signed, and out the door within 24 hours one day. Now, we're going stupid about it. There's some that are more complex, you take more time, but just screen those out. And guess what happened from that? It became really an exciting thing that the first person, very often a younger person, began to grow and began to know how to reach out. And the so-called supervisors became colleagues and coaches who were seeing the success of that first draft person. And the quote efficiency of the office became really important. But it was all about not just doing the thing right, checking the boxes, but doing the right thing. And the right thing was, we have an important role in the governance of this country and moving paper appropriately so decisions can be made, a commission can be issued, and someone can get their promotion, etc. is absolutely important, and we get it done with pride. And there was a somewhat dysfunctional office when we arrived, and thanks to a really good secretary to the Office of Governor General, Stephen Wallace, who ran the office, I went to the clerk of the Privy Council, the position was becoming vacant with retirement. I said, Wayne, you got 12, 15, 20 people who you see as potential successors for you. I want one of them for 5 years to run this office. And Stephen came, and he was marvelous because he just espoused that property, that policy, that philosophy of doing the right thing. The other illustration I give of that, Susan, and I'll cease and desist here because I could go on for length of this, is in the interviews of the different people that we were looking at for this position, I asked each of them how they go about developing a strategic plan for the office. And to my great surprise, when I arrived, there was no strategic plan. There had not been a history of strategic planning, and surely there is. I mean, it may have a different word, but you know, person coming to that office says, what does this office do? What do you want it to do? And how are you going to get there? And that's a strategic plan. And Stephen said, look, I can draft a strategic plan for you over a weekend, but you don't want that. Give me 3 months so that every single person in the organization shares in the preparation of that document, and they did. And that ethos of doing the right thing and being driven by that purpose just became part of the philosophy of the place. And so that office, in the last 2 years that we were there, Stephen's leadership especially, became the employer of choice of all the agencies of the Government of Canada. And it was really that philosophy at work. I could go on, Susan, but that's an illustration of looking at the fundamental purpose. What are you trying to do? And is that effective as opposed to ticking all the boxes?
Yeah. Well, we certainly live in a time where we are hearing a lot more about purpose. I was in a session yesterday where TELUS came and spoke about their purpose. And I think your example illustrates how you can reshape people's mindsets and bring them to a higher level, and that's got to be good for trust. If we're all rowing in the same direction, we all want the same things, and we have some agreement on how, that's got to be very helpful.
Yeah, just to add to that, Susan, you know, my definition of leadership is recognizing your total dependence on the people around you. Now, there are other features of leadership, but that sounds kind of trite, doesn't it? Recognizing your total dependence on the people around you. You know, find a good parade, get yourself up to the front of it, you're leading it. What a fantastic leader with this parade. No, it's, as leader, you're responsible for creating an environment where each person who's part of that parade or part of that team can function at the very limits of their talents and are pretty excited about doing that. And guess what? Their talents expand at that point of time. It's creating an environment where people can flourish, and having a sense of purpose in what they do is a very big part of that. And that's what a leader does. The leader creates the environment where that kind of philosophy, that modus operandi actually works and is real.
Yeah.
I can give you one more example, and forgive me for going on link with these studies. These stories, I was functioned as an advisor to Deloitte for a period shortly after I stepped down as GG. And we did a study on trust with one of the major Canadian banks. They were responding to the Wells Fargo disaster, where I think something like 3 million different accounts were falsified to increase fees on the particular customers because they had an incentive system of the teller or the person at the branch would be rewarded for every additional service that they could persuade a customer to take on, etc. And really, it was a tragic situation because Wells Fargo goes back to the Pony Express, 150 years of handling mail and financial transactions, etc. And, you know, largely destroyed overnight. It's come back, but you know, how empires can fall. So this particular Canadian bank, with the help of Deloitte and a couple of great professors from the Harvard Business School who work on trust, developed a system for the tellers at the coalface with the customer on how they could establish trustworthy relationships, the antithesis to what had happened at Wells Fargo. And they had 100 branches that used this new system with all of the boxes to tick, and then 100 branches that just carried on as usual. And at the end of a year, they looked at it, and there was very little difference in terms of customer satisfaction or increased profitability or whatever in the 100 branches that were using the system. And they were smart enough then to sit down with the people in those 100 branches to say, you know, somehow we thought this was a great idea, but it didn't work. What's wrong? And they said, well, we had these requirements with respect to the external face of the bank, but not within the internal face. It was a system of silos. There was distrust from the regional office to the head office, etc. It was only skin deep, the external face, not the internal face. So they were smart enough to repeat the experiment, but this time using the same kind of philosophy with the internal relationships as well as the external relationships. And guess what happened? It was a great success.
Oh, no doubt. Trust really is that glue that we talk about. You know, the theme of personal responsibility that runs through your book, and clearly your own philosophy of how to make things better, was very compelling. And I believe this was the last chapter. It was a call to action almost. And I want to read you one of my favorite quotes from Goethe, the German statesman. He said, "Whatever you can do or dream, you can. Begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it." And essentially saying, begin with the end in mind and just begin it now. Just get going, get started. So given the challenges we have globally and nationally and locally and with our organizations, but given the power of individuals and the ability to shift mindsets, what are the smaller big things you would encourage all of us to do to strengthen trust, to strengthen the fabric of our country, and to take our place in the world as Canadians? What are small or big? What would you say to the 200 people in this conference on how we could make a difference with trust?
Well, you referred to Goethe. I refer to George Bernard Shaw as well, Susan, who once said in this beautiful couplet, which I changed a little bit from his phraseology because it works a little better for me, that as some people see things as they are and wonder why, we dream of things that ought to be and ask why not. And it's so appropriate not just for an individual, but for a university. Some people see things as they are and wonder why. That's what university is all about, curiosity, anti-truth, that is, what is the existing truth, and we put it to test and improve on it, etc. But I love the second one, we dream. That's looking forward of things that ought to be. That's a moral purpose. And ask why not, that's a call to action. I mean, that's a wonderful, I think, way of putting it. I can answer your question best by, I'll quote two people, Mother Teresa and Queen Elizabeth, and perhaps I'll just stay with the one story, and if we have time, I can tell the Queen Elizabeth story. Mother Teresa was in Montreal 25 or 30 years ago, and she spoke at the Montreal prayer breakfast that I've been involved in over the years. And the group of our neighbors gathered with her after he had spoken brilliantly and said, "Mother Teresa, we're so moved by your call to action. What can we do to help?" And I, being a university president, thought she would say, "Write a large check to my foundation in Calcutta and the settlement home we run for 200 homeless people, and I assure you that money we put to good use." She said, "Look in your own neighborhood, look in your own family. I guarantee you'll find someone who needs your love and care." And that really stayed with me. And then the next day after her speech, the 4 Montreal newspapers all did pieces on it, and 3 of them were very complimentary. The 4th was one of those newspapers who was practicing, I guess, what you call realpolitik, seeing things as they are. And they said, Mother Teresa was here yesterday and she gave a very touching speech to 500 of the good and the great in Montreal, the religious folks. If you look at what she said, and her example, she looks after 200 homeless people in Calcutta, and that's a good thing, and we salute her, and she'll probably be canonized by the Catholic Church for good works. But to be practical, that's a city of 20 million people, over half of whom are in destitute situation in a country with very large segments of their population that live in very, very abject circumstances. What she does is a mere drop in the bucket, a drop in the ocean. And that bothered me for the longest time. And then we were in London, our dean of the law school there, and our 5 daughters were young, and we'd have birthday parties, and my job was to tell ghost stories to the kids to enlighten them. And after one of them, our eldest daughter, who was then, I think, 10, said, "Dad, the ghost stories you tell at the parties? The kids know you're just making them up, and they pretend to be scared because they know if they don't, it might hurt your feelings. Why can't you be like Dean McFarlane? He does magic at his birthday parties." He was the dean of the School of Journalism. So I went over to a birthday party at the McFarlane household a few months later, and there was Andy McFarlane dressed like a magician doing magic. And he had a big cape on, he had a cap on, he had a mustache like this, and he was doing card tricks, and the kids thought he was marvelous. And then he held up a glass of water like this. I had one in front of me, and he said, "I will turn this water into wine." And I had to be careful, Andy. The last time that was tried was 2,000 years ago by someone who had a little more influence than you do. But in his sleeve, he had a dropper with an eyedropper with a drop of red vegetable dye. And he dropped it into the glass of water, and he held it up and said, "Abracadabra," shook it, and the clear liquid turned to a beautiful shade of rosé. And I thought, that's Mother Teresa's drop in the ocean, drop in the bucket. And I've been looking at it from a mathematical or a physics point of view when I should have looked at it as chemical engineering. That one drop of red dye interacted with the H2 molecules and changed their nature. And that's what you do with these individual acts. You change the culture. Queen Elizabeth tells the story of a pebble into a pond of goodness, of good acts, caring for your neighbor, and it ripples across the pond. Same idea of changing the culture of the pond, changing the world. And that's what we do when we, look after our neighbor in the simplest ways each day. It's like a ripple that crosses the pond. I just finished this story, Susan, by saying, one of the things I enjoyed most, Sharon and I, being GG, is visiting communities across the country. I always thought this was a good country. Never realized how good it was till we met these people face to face in their communities. And we developed a award called the Sovereign's Medal in Voluntarism to recognize these unsung heroes, etc. But I had kind of an index of trying to determine the percentage of volunteers in a community on a per capita basis. Mm-hmm. And if it was above the national average, by and large, that community was flourishing, healthy, etc. And if it was below the national average, that community was suffering, etc. Those acts of kindness, volunteerism being a prime example, are so important in building the social capital, the fabric of a nation. And, simply, all of the world's great religions, in one way or another, have as a fundamental theme the golden rule: treat others as you would be treated yourself, love thy neighbor. That's simple, but sometimes difficult to operate with.
Well, it's a powerful takeaway from the book that we all have agency and we can affect the world around us, from our families to our communities to the nation to the globe, and we can make change even when times seem really turbulent. So I think that's a great and inspiring message for today. I do want to make sure we have time for questions, but I have one last question for you, given the discussion we've had. Tell me what makes you optimistic about our future.
Well, number one, as a practical matter, it's the only way to go. If you wander around with a cloud over your head and everything is going to hell in a handbasket, it's not a very good way to live. But I'm optimistic because I think by nature, human nature is good. I'm a person of faith, but original sin is something that doesn't sit very well with me. I think people are actually born with an instinct. One, they're needy, think of little babies. But two, they have an instinct to help others, perhaps as a way of just, that's how we survive in a society. We help others beyond ourselves. And the inscription to the trust book is to children who offer their trust, in confidence, who offer their trust implicitly in the expectation of fairness. So that's, I think, a basic instinct that we have in front of us. And I guess I've learned through my life that the people who've influenced me most are people who have experienced in their life the joy of helping others. And that becomes, very much a part of how they lead their life. And that too makes me an optimist. And I guess the other thing I'd say is, my heavens, I was born in a very modest family in a resource town, Sault Ste. Marie. And, in many societies, I'd be digging potatoes or cutting pulpwood or something like that. I had an opportunity for a good education in this great country and other countries. I studied first in the States and then the United Kingdom. And how lucky we are to live in this country and have the blessings. How can you be other than optimistic with all that we have before us and what we can do together?
Well, we are extraordinarily lucky, and gratitude is a good thing to express, reminding us. So at this point, David, let's turn to the audience. I'm sure there are some questions for you. You've written a great book, lots of wisdom, and had an extraordinary life. So I'm looking to my colleagues from the business school. It's a little bit hard to see out inside. Are there any questions? Over here, I think.
Yeah, I've got one. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I'm wondering if you have any advice for organizational leaders facing broken trust, how to repair. I mean, we've seen so many examples. In fact, Rideau Hall had challenges, the Hockey Canada, military, and how does an organizational leader, particularly a new leader that has to come in to fix a situation of broken trust, what sort of guidance or coaching would you give them?
What an important question. Trust comes in on foot and goes out on horseback. Or Mark Carney's modernization of that is trust comes in on foot and goes out in a Ferrari. It's slow to build and quick to destroy. Number one is when mistakes have been made, own up to them right away, fully, apologetically, no clouding over, etc., directly, that this has gone wrong, point one. And then point two, so this is our situation and what are we going to do to rebuild? And typically that rebuilding is not being done by the great I.M.E. who's got the 10 commandments at the mountain as Moses did and says, this is what we'll do. We're going to sit down as an organization and figure out what went wrong. Why on earth did Wells Fargo go south? Well, because they set in a crazy incentive scheme right from the top of encouraging people to sell at any cost and just threw the notion of fiduciary responsibility or fairness out the window. And then the concrete, hard sledding actions of how we rebuild trust. The classic case is our relationship with our Indigenous people and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in particular with its recommendations. And I'm really optimistic because I see a new optimism in Indigenous young people about how we overcome the tragedies of the residential schools, etc., where we actually tried to change the culture of a whole group of people across the country. And a couple of the specific things, let me pay tribute to what is being done in reconciliation as a classic case of a mistake and how do we rebuild, of both the University of Victoria and Vancouver Island University. University of Victoria, in its law faculty, which is just splendid, has John Burroughs as a professor teaching Indigenous law and has introduced Indigenous law as a stream along with the common law in which you can get a degree. John spent a year at my beloved McGill University in the law faculty there, which teaches the two great legal systems of Western civilization, the common law from the United Kingdom and the civil law from continental Europe, under one roof. And John spent a year there working on developing the third stream, Indigenous law, which is now at the University of Victoria. And isn't that a great way of getting on the path of reconciliation to say, golly, we have something to learn about pre-colonial era law and what has been handed down. And not only learn about it, but respect it. Just to stretch that analogy a little bit, Canada has been so lucky because we've avoided extremes. We've never had revolutions. We weren't born out of revolution. And when the Plains of Abraham War took place and the Peace of Paris shortly after that, the conclusion was that rather than seeing French Canadian people as a conquered group and their nobles all gone back to France, they were equal partners in this new country, which was Canada. And they were promised their language and their religion, and their law is guaranteed. Their law was the civil law from Europe, from continental Europe. Now, people at the time would have said, how on earth can you make two systems of law work in a country? It's impossible. We made it work. We don't have difficulties with civil law in Quebec and common law. Supreme Court of Canada can handle both. And we're a country with a better rule of law because our rule of law is informed from two different traditions. And I think that will happen as we learn more about Indigenous law. That's the University of Victoria. Vancouver Island University and 3 or 4 other colleges and universities across the country work with our Rita Hall Foundation with a $23 million grant from the MasterCard Foundation. It's headquartered in Toronto. It's now about $50 billion Canadian in assets, which is a pretty large foundation. And what we were doing there is working on the transition from complete high school for Indigenous young people and then the successful transfer into first-year college or first-year university. And out of that MasterCard relationship has become a new project, which really excites me. It's educating 10,000 young Indigenous people as teachers over the next decade or so. And we will do that by local partnerships, like we see at Vancouver Island University, University of Victoria, et cetera, faculties of education, local Indigenous groups, other partners like Inspire, et cetera, so that the teacher's education will be all of the appropriate pedagogical skills, etc., but steeped in Indigenous culture and Indigenous history, etc. And that's really capacity building of our education system. If we can establish teaching as a noble profession and build capacity in our schools and eliminate the education gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, that's a big step forward with respect to truth and reconciliation. My installation address in 2010, which was entitled "A Smart and Caring Nation, A Call to Service," I said, if you remember only 3 words of what I say today, they are cherish our teachers, because apart from our family, it's our teachers who've had the most influence on us. And if we had 3 hours in the Senate chamber, I'd tell you 25 stories of different teachers, mentors, etc., who've influenced my life in a positive way. And that notion of 10,000 teachers, so that we really build teaching as a noble profession, as a new buffalo to our Indigenous people, is a big step forward with respect to how you right or wrong. And I would see, let's do it with teachers, and let's do the next program with nurses, and so on and on and on.
Thank you, David. Do we have other questions? I'm seeing.
Do we have one from the right side?
Oops. Yes, I do have a couple, if I could sneak them in. The first one is, you were talking a lot about trust, which I think has got a huge moral context to it. And you used the Wells Fargo example of the executives pressuring down through the system. But what stands against trust? What makes those executives choose to do the wrong thing? And the second question is related to your example of Canada being such a tremendous place for education. I believe that's a wonderful story. But how do we prevent siphoning off all the talent from those countries that come here and then do not return? How do we encourage the cooperation that is necessary to bring education back to their own countries? Thanks.
Yeah, 2 really important questions. Just give the first one again so I get it very clear. The second one, the brain drain, I'll deal with. The first one again.
Sorry, if I could, it was just what stands against the concept of trust? What's the
Sure. What are the enemies of trust? Yeah. Well, in the business context, it's short-termism. It's profits above all. It is the extreme of the capitalist philosophy that it's all about reward to shareholders and not a consciousness of stakeholders, etc. I mean, those are the kind of, and I think short-termism has really hurt us a lot, but managing an enterprise for next quarter results. And if you look at Boeing, if you look at Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, Enron, those great tragedies, they just lost sight of treating their customers with a fiduciary relation, a trust relationship, and ended up, Volkswagen hasn't gone under. They seem to have recovered, and Wells Fargo has. Enron did, of course. But it's that obsession with profit above all else, and that's your reward system right through the organization. I think that causes these aberrations and this mistrustful conduct. And I think for a society, when it's all about I, you got a monster like Putin, for example, that out of his own strange psyche sees himself as Peter the Great, and is going to revive the Russian Empire. And the fact that tens of thousands of people in Ukraine are slaughtered, that's just collateral damage. That happens. I mean, that's an excessive example, but it's just so far removed from the sense of concern for our neighbor, etc. So I guess that's what you work at. You work at building trust, and you see where the enemies of trust are, and be sure that you rid your organization of them. The second question again?
Could we have the second question repeated?
It was the siphoning off of the educated people from third world countries.
Yeah, the brain drain issue. I'm not concerned actually about Canadians getting a good education here and going abroad. In fact, if we applied that test, we would be on the very wrong side of the ledger, because we have been taking the brains out of so many other countries and continue to do in an accentuated way, which I think is an appropriate thing for Canada, because I think we bring people here and they have an opportunity to flourish, etc. I'm not unduly concerned about some portion of our bright young people. At the University of Waterloo, we used to be criticized for our splendid math and computer science graduates, you know, going to work for Microsoft as they did, or for any of the other Silicon Valley companies, because what would happen is some of them would be there and develop an apprenticeship, and then when they started to have a family and were concerned about education systems and housing and so on, and civil, safe neighborhoods, they'd come back to Canada, and that will happen. But more broadly, you know, this country was settled because people left their other countries for a better opportunity for themselves, and in fact built a better country. And I tell a story. I grew up in Sault Ste. Marie, and around about grade 10, the Harvard University was attempting to broaden the base of its students by reaching out to public high schools, because it was largely a place for, the college was at least, for kids from private schools in the US. And an alumnus from Minneapolis, St. Paul was looking for scholar athletes. I was a good athlete and a good scholar. We began corresponding, and by the time of my final year, this is where I wanted to go, and I went to the principal of our school to write a letter of recommendation. He was a really good man. He was a teacher of science and a good principal, but had a fairly provincial outlook. And he said, I won't write the letter of reference to you. He said, you're a good kid, and you're bright and so on, and I don't want you going to a third-rate American university. And I said, sir, I'm sure there's some third-rate ones, but I think you know this one is not third-rate. He says, well, he said, you know, if you go there, you'll stay there and you'll be lost to Canada. And I can't stomach that. You're a talented kid. I don't want to see you go. I said, sir, surely that's my decision to make. And, you know, I'm 17 years old. I can't tell you what my future is, but I really think I'll be back in Canada. I think this is a great place, and I think I'll probably be a little better by, you know, going to a first-class university. You know, I'm not going to write the letter. So I went down the hall to the football coach, who was also a history teacher. He says, I'll write a letter of reference for you. He said, you've been a big frog in a really small pond. And he says, you've got to get your head knocked off by people who are meaner, tougher, stronger, and smarter than you are. And I went, and guess that's what happened. I got my head knocked off, and I learned a few things out of it. But that, I don't think we should worry too much, actually, about our bright young people going abroad and doing things. And I think many of them will come back, and many who don't will be great ambassadors and develop lots of knowledge for us. So one-sided view, and I know other people have a strongly different view than what my friend Mike Lazaridis, who ran BlackBerry in Waterloo, and Mike invested about $350 million in physics, quantum computing in and around Waterloo. Extraordinary. But he was quite set in the notion that with our marvelous co-op program, we should not allow Microsoft to come and poach our bright students. They'd pick up the bright ones in the first year. They'd go to Microsoft, and they would be named as ambassadors for Microsoft back on the campus, so they'd recruit other kids there. And Bill Gates was smart enough he'd have a big barbecue at his home once a year, and he'd invite 300 or 400 interns, as they were young students, including the Waterloo ones, and they'd come back and they'd say, well, you know, when I had lunch over at Bill and Melinda's house, and, you know, had a chat and so on, so on. So, you know, that was another guy's view who had a very different view, that we should sort of constrain our talents and keep within, but I have a different view.
Well, thank you, David. Well, this brings us to the end of our session. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and I particularly want to express our thanks to David for sharing his thoughts, his insight, his time, and helping us think about how we can use trust and increase trust as we help our country move forward. I'm Susan Black. I hope you've enjoyed today's plenary and are looking forward to some more exciting discussions. I believe we have a session on sports as a great unifier, supply chain fragility. I believe the Conference Board is doing a session on deglobalization later. Still much more to come today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. Thank you, David.
Thank you very much once again to Susan Black, CEO of the Conference Board of Canada, and of course the Right Honourable David Johnston, former Governor General of Canada. Thank you once again. A couple of additions to my earlier comments about activities throughout the day. Just a reminder that after our roundtable discussions this afternoon, we will meet back in this auditorium at 5:30 p.m. for our closing plenary. I had referenced the bus that will be taking people back to the hotel. That bus will be leaving at 7:45 p.m. And I did have a conversation with Dean Klein, and you can all relax a little bit because the exam that will take place at the end of the Victoria Forum will be an open book exam. So we're going to take 5 minutes, a very brief break as we transition the stage for our next panel discussion. Thank you.